Okay, well, I think I'll pass on, explaining who I am and my background and everything. Probably some of you have been, or most of you have been on past trainings. And just to remind here with this Zoom stuff, of course, it's hard to have an interchange, but at the same time, particularly when you deal with really, fraught subjects, you got to have an opportunity for ask questions, make comments and stuff. So you can do that whenever in chat box. You can send Ryan a question. You can just break in. Any of that stuff works fine for me. You don't have to wait until I pause, though occasionally I will try to pause here. And so, so this morning we're going to talk. This is a big subject. I mean, critical thinking is a big subject, and I taught for several years in the MSW program at UW, and of course that's a quarter system. It'd be very, very easy for me to do a 10-week class on critical thinking. I wouldn't run out of material in 10 weeks. So obviously anything we say in an hour here is going to be a very partial idiosyncratic version of a very big complex subject. And I just have a particular take on this that's somewhat different than some other people. It doesn't mean they're wrong. It doesn't mean that I'm right or that I'm wrong. It's just, so I have an idea about parts of this subject that I think have the most pertinence and most usefulness in child welfare for decision makers. I mean, not just for people who work in child welfare, but for those of you who have some kind of decision-making responsibility, and for the courts as well here. So with that, I guess first what I want to do here, just real briefly, is just to ask you, and you can respond and you can break in, you can say something in chat. I mean, when you think of critical thinking, what kind of ideas come to your mind? And this isn't a right or wrong answer thing. I mean, just what ideas do you associate with the concept of critical thinking? I mean, you must have some kind of associations here. You must have some kind of thoughts about it. So
asking questions.
Yeah, so part of it is, being able to ask critical questions. If you can't do that, I don't know how there could even be any critical inquiry. Analyzing both sides, that's a good answer. So, and then just being curious about both sides of an argument. And sometimes it's not two sides of an argument, it's several sides of an argument. Looking at evidence, this is kind of one of the main ways I think about critical thinking. Is taking a hard look at evidence. And we'll go back about why do people believe what they believe about any particular kind of thing, and then whatever that hard look is that one takes at other people's beliefs, you can apply the same standards, the same kind of rigorous kind of demands for rational clarity to your own beliefs, to your own arguments, right? Any other kind of ideas here? I ask caseworkers this question. I've done this training for a lot of years with staff in DCYF, and even before that in the Children's Administration. And what people usually say in child welfare, one of the first answers is someone will say, it's thinking out of the box. It's kind of a creative problem solving. Sometimes people think of critical thinking as kind of being really good at deduction, kind of like, like a Sherlock Holmes type of detective, a speed of light kind of ability to link observation to deduction in a way that arrives at a conclusion when everyone else has just kind of gotten started in kind of slow, clumsy way with thinking something through. And some brilliant Sherlock Holmes type detective has already arrived at the answer because they've done it intuitively, many, many steps in a lightning fast kind of a way. So those are very common kind of ideas. I mean, I think the focus that, and I'm not saying that's wrong or anything. It's just that's not going to be the focus of this particular discussion. So what I'm going to talk about more is critical thinking as self-reflection, critical thinking as being able to have conscious, strategies to control bias. And we're going to talk here at some length about bias as it applies to the decision-making process here. I also have a strong emphasis on critical thinking as being a social process, and I'm going to try to explain why that is as we go through the next hour here. But I guess the thought that I would like to start with is I don't think that anyone does really good critical thinking in an isolated way. I think for reasons I'm going to try to explain, that's really next to impossible. And so truth seeking in human services, just as it is in science, in my view, it's a social process. And so we have to learn kind of, in order to do it well, we have to learn certain kind of social behaviors, particularly civility and the ability to hear people out that we don't necessarily agree with, or maybe not even like personally, or really don't share their values. But if you're going to have any kind of critical inquiry, you have to be able to listen to people with whom you don't agree. And you have to be able to hear other people say that they don't agree with you without getting super upset and defensive and so on. And that doesn't mean you necessarily have to agree with them that you're wrong. When I do training for people in DCYF, I emphasize that there is very definitely an organizational culture aspect to critical thinking. That is, there has to be the ability, regardless of where someone is in that chain of command, what kind of authority someone has, to ask that person critical questions. And for example, if caseworkers cannot ask a middle manager, an area administrator, or a regional administrator for rational reasons for why the agency has a particular policy, and if somehow that kind of critical questioning is viewed as dissing or as disrespectful, there really can't be any much critical thinking in that organization. So, I mean, there really has to be a social milieu that supports critical questioning, back and forth, civil dispute, civil exchange of views. There has to be that kind of thing for there to be much critical thinking. So the themes that I'm going to focus on here in the next hour have a lot to do with issues of self-reflection, and they have to do with issues of organizational culture, and with just learning some good basic principles for how to think through something in a way that makes it more likely that you will come to a reasonable decision. And one of the ideas that I want to get across right off the bat is all of us, and this isn't just a function of expertise or knowledge or anything like that, all of us are vulnerable to error. And until someone understands that, in my view, critical thinking is just kind of an abstraction. It's just kind of like, well, maybe someone has some modest amount of interest in it. It's only when you've had the experience. I worked in child welfare for more than 30 years in 2 states. Okay, I had several experiences where I made decisions that really affected the lives of other people. I mean, in really concrete ways. When those decisions were in retrospect, I would say were mistaken, were very, very poor. I regret them. And so I learned pretty quickly, and most people I think who are experienced in child welfare do learn quickly, that everyone makes mistakes. And that's very, very common. And that's even true of the most knowledgeable of us, right? And so there has to be the ability to learn from those mistakes. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about here today. Because once you understand that you're vulnerable to error, then you want to hopefully come up with strategies and with ideas that's going to limit the possibility of making really, really bad decisions that affect other people's lives. So that's my sort of initial take on it. So what I want to do here is start off with a little bit of an exercise for you. So I want to imagine all of you are CASAs, I guess. And so imagine that you've just been assigned a case, or you've accepted a case where you're going to be a CASA to a child that's been known to the child welfare system for some time. Let's say that the child's already dependent and already had CASA, and maybe that CASA resigned or left or whatever reason. And so now you're coming on board with this case, and there are multi-volumes here. The child is, let's say the child is around 2 years old, maybe came into the foster care system when the child was, a month or two old. The agency has known this child and mother and parents for pretty much all of the child's lives. And so now, in the next week or so, there's going to be a staffing around a permanent plan for this child. And let's say that, for example, a relative from out of state who's never ever met the child has got in touch with the agency saying that they would like to adopt a child, and the child has been in a non-relative foster home for almost 2 years, and now there's going to be a staffing around what's the best permanent plan for this child. And so this is a decision that is going to shape this child's life. How would you choose to prepare for this staffing if you had 3 choices? I'm going to give you the 3 choices. And I'm not saying that these are the only choices there are. It's just that these are the 3 I'm going to present with you. So if you had an opportunity, you would read the whole entire record, or you would at least flip through the whole entire DCYF record, even if it was a few hundred pages, even if it took you a whole afternoon in the office to do that, or maybe 2 afternoons in the office. But if you had the opportunity, you would flip through every page of that record. Or you might say, no, I would almost want to do the exact opposite thing. I would want to go through the record and look for summaries. I guess I would go to the part of the case plans in the record that, the kind of summaries that judges actually look at most of the time. They don't read all those 32-page case plans. I mean, they're going to a summary. So you might say, well, I want to read those court summaries, and maybe I want to read some of the summaries of the investigative things that happened in the case initially and so forth. But I definitely am not going to read the whole record. I'm going to read some very small sample of the record, and the part of the sample that summarizes the main information and the main decisions. Or you might say, no, I don't like that, either of those ideas really. I don't really learn anything about people, about families, unless I hear a story. So I want someone who is very well informed about this family, who's dealt with them for some time. I would like to actually sit down with them, hopefully, or at least talk with them on the phone at some length. And I want them to give me a narrative about what happened initially to bring this child into foster care, what's happened since that point with services to the parent or the parents, what's happened with this child in foster care, what's happened with the issues around family search and so forth. So I want someone to tell me a story. So now you have a choice between these 3 approaches. And granted that in lots of instances we use more than one of these approaches, and probably other kind of ways of arriving at decisions as well. But now I want you to make a choice. Which of these 3 ways of dealing with things, with kind of a run up to an important decision, would you prefer if you had a choice? So who would prefer? You would say, well, if I had the time, I would read the whole entire record. So you can either raise your hand, or you can put it in chat, or whatever. If you had the opportunity, you would read the whole entire record. Anyone? Okay. How about the summary? You would go for the summary. So I'm seeing at least 2, 3. I can see 4 people on the screen, and 3 of you are saying you would look at the summary kind of thing. Okay. Is there anyone else? Is there anyone who would much prefer to hear a story? Is there anyone who, given an opportunity, would opt for the story? Okay, so let me tell you that I've asked this question of many groups of DCYF caseworkers and supervisors over a period of a few years, and I really never know how they're going to answer. So this is one of the few things. It's very unusual in training. I've done trainings for years, and where I do small group exercises where I know basically what people are going to say, because I've done the exercise with so many groups. But in this particular exercise, I never quite know what people are going to opt for. And again, this isn't a right or wrong thing. This is a matter of preference. This is a preference, right? So let's start off with, at least 3 out of the 4 of you said you would much prefer to look at summaries. So let's start off with that. Apart from the time involved, just the efficiency of things, Why would you prefer to look at summaries rather than a whole entire record? What is about summaries that you think are, is good from the standpoint of decision making?
Well, I think in this scenario, because the child, the case has been going on for a while, the child's been in foster care for years, you said.
Mhm.
The early history might not be as relevant to what's happening right now.
Mhm.
We're talking about, where this child should be placed. And so I think that a summary would be helpful to understand the previous history. And then I would want to talk to both relatives and foster parents.
Okay, so you would much prefer the summary, and part of the reason is that you think maybe the summary could deal with the early history pretty quickly with some pertinent information, not a huge amount, and then focus on the current issue there. Okay, so any other kind of reasons for choosing summaries over these other approaches?
I agree with Carolyn. I feel like more more often than not, summaries kind of, it's like a add-on, it's like a working document. I feel like it still contains like the original information, and then it just builds up from there. So it's a good way to kind of just understand where it all started, and then kind of get updates as the case moves on. But I was kind of hesitant a little bit, because I am more of a, I now that I'm thinking about it, I don't mind listening to a story either, but I like to also like educate myself, and then give the opportunity to kind of hear the story.
Okay, it's sort of
So
like the story. You would want some basic information, and then if you had your way, you would listen to a story.
yeah, I feel like.
Okay, so around the summary thing, apart from just the efficiency part of it, and so you probably understand that people who have power and responsibility in this world, they pretty much depend totally on summaries. People who are at the head of agencies, even people in middle management positions in DCYF, they very, very rarely are looking at records. They're looking at summaries, and they do it initially because of the time issues. But of course, over time, they come to prefer it for reasons that you've already said. And a lot of it has to do with just zeroing in on the pertinent information. And particularly with people who are very, very busy, the idea that, more information is not necessarily better from a decision-making standpoint. I mean, what lots of times people who have to make lots of decisions are trying to do is they're trying to zero in on the most pertinent information as efficiently as possible. And that's why people who have power in this world, and I mean political leaders and leaders of organizations, they almost totally 100% depend on summaries. However, just to remember here, someone is preparing that summary. So, so when think about the downside of summaries, someone prepared that summary. Whatever their mental framework was, whatever their biases, whatever their level of understanding was, it went into the preparation of that summary. And it's very likely when you read a summary, you won't know who wrote that summary. You won't know whether you trust their judgment, whether you view them as competent, even-handed, fair-minded, balanced. People who are powerful in this world, who have staff who prepare summaries for them, they use those people because obviously they come to trust them over time. And even so, they're turning over a lot of power to someone. I guess that's what I'm saying. If you depend on summaries, you are turning over a lot of power in the decision-making process to someone. So in political life, the lobbyists, for example, really understand this really, really well. I mean, that it's the staffer persons, for example, anyone who works for Senator Murray or Senator Cantwell or anyone who's head of a federal agency, they're depending on staff who are giving them summaries of, issue documents. And those staff who are doing that have acquired a lot of power in doing that. And they may use that power very well, and they may use it not so well. It can be done in a very manipulative way as well, right? So the idea here is to get everyone who makes decisions to think about how you're processing information. So summaries, looking at summaries, that's one very, very common way of doing it. Now, the issue around reading everything, I talk with some caseworkers where probably 2 out of 3, maybe people in the group will say that they would at least flip through every page in a record if they had the opportunity. And they would do it partly for reasons that I've already said, because they don't want to turn over power of deciding what's relevant information to someone else. They would rather make that decision for themselves. And they often find, as I have found in reading records, that sometimes mistakes that are made in the early phase of a case just get repeated over and over again. And people in the later phase who haven't read how the agency got involved in the first place take things as being sort of like, this is just factually the way it was, when it was someone's view of the way it was. And their view might or might not have been mistaken. It might have been correct, relevant, or so forth. You just have no way of making that kind of judgment about the quality of information unless you go through the record yourself. There is no way. Okay. So that's the advantage of looking at a whole entire record. At the same time, for lots of people, just to say this again, more information in the decision-making process is not necessarily better. More information a lot of times just overwhelms people. So when I worked for the agency for many, many years under different names, the Children's Administration, and even before that, the Division of Children and Family Services, if people in headquarters wanted to make sure that a discussion that they were going to have on some kind of fraught topic with a management team, to keep that discussion under control, a lot of times you just a few days before the meeting, you just send out a huge amount of information, which those people don't have the time to assimilate that information. So they're going to come to the meeting knowing that they haven't read hundreds of pages of relevant information. And so if they start popping off in unwise ways here about how things are, and they just have the potential to be exposed there, to be very vulnerable. They haven't mastered the information. And so that was a favorite strategy for how to keep budget discussions under control in the first place. Just overwhelm people with factual information. When I was a manager, there was all this stuff about dealing with news media. And I used to tell managers at the top this over and over again. You don't have to refuse to talk to newspaper people. Just overwhelm them with information. I mean, it's a very effective strategy because it's very hard to come to grips with all of that, right? That's the strategy that tort attorneys use when they do depositions and so forth. If the state wants to defend itself against a tort action, it drowns the plaintiff's attorneys in documents. I mean, that's just a tried and true strategy for how to confuse everyone, right? Okay. So again, reading all of a record, it's got a positive upside and it's got a downside. And I guess the idea I'm trying to get across is that's true of every way that we use to process information. So let's talk about the story thing for a second. Why do we all like stories? What's the value of stories? Because we like them. Watch TV series, watch movies, read novels, read short stories, gossip.
I think it adds like a human element to it. I don't know, like versus reading something on paper. I don't know if that makes sense.
It brings the human aspect home. So I've gotten, I read lots of research in peer-reviewed journals and so forth, and I really have gotten pretty tired of just reading analyses of administrative data without any sort of explanation of how this really affects real people. Mm-hmm. Really. So the research that I like the best is the research that combines data with some sort of a qualitative element. That is, how does this really affect people? Specific individuals there, right? So yeah, stories have a human element that data or just pure information just lacks. What else? Why else do we like stories?
Easier to follow along. Follow along to, maybe. I don't.
That, yeah, and particularly depending on the quality of the storytelling, but stories tend to connect the dots. So there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's a kind of an end. So there's a kind of a narrative, that's inherent in stories. They begin somewhere, they kind of explain how you get to the next point, and so there's a a framework for understanding events. And
Mhm.
stories have an emotional component that information just lacks. So, and that's why it seems like to me, we connect with them. So if you want to hear, a political leader in either party, in anywhere in the world, if they want to persuade someone of something, they don't start off with data or with information. They start off with a story about the effect of a specific policy on a person. And then they might provide a very, very small amount of data, a very, very small amount of information. They would start off with a story because it's a story that makes the emotional connection to the audience. So if you want to persuade someone of something, you tell them a story. I mean, if you want to, analyze something, maybe you give people information. But if you want to persuade people of something, of your point of view, you tell them a story.
Mhm.
So given that, what's the downside of stories? I mean, again, every kind of approach to processing information has an upside and it has a downside. What's the downside of stories?
Kind
I
of the
think
same
there's
thing with.
probably,
Oh, go ahead, Carolyn.
there's probably data that's left out because the story is trying to be cohesive. It's trying to make sense. And there's probably perspectives and information that are left out of that story.
Yeah, a lot of information, a lot, and so stories tend to have a particular kind of a perspective. That's what makes them interesting, right? And to do that, you have to very carefully select the elements that go into a story. A good short story writer thinks very carefully about the details that they put into the story. And again, more is not better here. It's depending on what you want to persuade, depending on the effect that you want to have of the story, you choose the details in the story very, very carefully. If you want to communicate a point of view that has a bias in it without people being aware that there's a bias, you tell people a story. It's very easy to communicate biases in stories, much more effective, much easier than by just giving people very biased arguments that are very slanted on the surface of it, right? Much easier to do that in stories. Now, the other element of stories is just a little bit, I have to explain this a little bit. Stories tend to get told more than one time, and because they do, there's a kind of in the process of telling stories over and over again, stories get shaped based on the response of audiences. Mm-hmm. And so what tends to happen with storytellers is that little by little, they change the story based on the response of audiences so that the interesting parts of the story get retained. And the more boring parts of the story, the parts that the audiences weren't very interested in the first place, that gets discarded over time. That doesn't necessarily line up with what was true or false in the story. So it's very easy to add elements to stories that are false that make them interesting, or to give them undue weight because that is the element of the story that people find interesting, while you simply drop out the boring parts, or you drop out the less interesting parts. So part of the issue with storytelling is, what are storytellers really trying to do? And sometimes they're just trying to get a response from an audience or to get the interest of an audience. They're not necessarily trying to communicate the truth about something. And that's an inherent kind of issue in storytelling. So one of the things that I've learned to do over the years is when we talking about cases in child welfare, if someone is telling me a very, very interesting story, a very compelling story, and I find that I start to have real strong emotional reactions to it, I always want to ask myself the question, that's interesting, is that really true? Did that really happen like that? So it just turns out that, for example, when I read a lot of personal kind of memoirs, people writing about their childhoods or maybe their early lives or whatever, maybe about their entire lives. Very common for people who write memoirs to put fictional elements into those stories, right? And sometimes the writers will even admit it. I mean, I heard someone on Terry Gross, right, the fresh air thing that's been on public radio for 30 years or something. I heard a memoirist one time, Terry Gross, after talking with this writer for an hour, she finally said, God, what a powerful story you're telling. But I just have to ask, she said, is everything that you say that happened in your childhood, did that really happen just the way you told it? And the guy pauses for a second, then he says, well, let me put it this way. I never let a fact get in the way of a good story. You understand what the guy's saying? It's a fictional memoir. It's a memoir that has big elements of truth in it, probably, and it's elements that there are fictional elements as well that build on the themes that the author wants to emphasize. And so that's sort of the downside of stories. So one of the things that I try to tell people in child welfare, particularly policymakers, stories tend to excite passions. That's why people like them. That's why people tell them to other people. If you're talking about policy making, however, I'm not here talking about the kind of decisions that you would be involved in as CASAs, but if you're talking about policy making kind of stuff, then you don't want to have passionate discussions. You want dispassionate discussions. You don't want to start off with stories with anecdotes here that tilt groups in a certain kind of way. You want to start off with information. So sometimes you don't, passion is not what's wanted. To heighten emotions is not what is desirable. They're very opposite a lot of times is desirable depending on the goal of the meeting here, right? So, okay, again, just one more time. Why do I start off with this little exercise in critical thinking training? Is to sort of get across the idea that any way we come to decisions, we processed information in some kind of a way. We didn't go from A to Z. There were steps in between. Whatever approach that we are using to make decisions has got an upside. That's why we're using it, because it has a benefit for us. It fits our temperament. We just plain like it better. But it also has a downside. Every way of processing information has got a downside. And so to be a better decision maker, you got to kind of, over time, develop strategies for tempering the downside. And so that's why I say in stories, if you really find your emotions being stirred by a story that you're listening to, then you should step back, get a little bit of a detached point of view and ask yourself the question, is everything that I'm hearing true? Is that what really happened, right? And if you're trying to read a whole entire record in preparation for a decision, you might, after reading about 100 pages of it, you might ask yourself the question, is this making things clear for me, or I'm just getting more confused the more that I read, right? At which point we might want to go to a summary. If you're using summaries, you need to consider the possibility that someone didn't do a fair and balanced summary of what really happened there. You can't take everything that you read in a summary as just being the gospel truth about something, because a lot of times it's just another person's point of view, which then gets repeated over and over and over again in a case that's particularly been in the agency for really a long time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the issue of bias here. And so, what does it mean to talk about bias in normal usage? Like if you were to say about someone that you work with or that you meet, well, that person is really biased about whatever. What are you saying about them? What does it mean to describe someone as biased in normal language?
They favor someone because of a personal preference.
Yeah, well, they definitely got a preference, but it seems like to me that we all of us most of the time have preferences. So so that's a part of bias, but it's not the whole entire thing. So what else are we saying? In addition to someone having a preference or maybe even having a very strong opinion about something, what else are we saying about them if we say that they're biased?
I think one thing we see happening is a person starts sorting out the information that they're receiving and just taking the pieces that are helpful and confirm their previous perspective and disregarding the rest of it. Yeah.
So, I mean, what we're really in it, that's particularly that kind of bias I'm going to talk about here in just kind of a minute, but when most of the time when we talk about people bias, we're talking about people having a fixed opinion. Their mind is made up. Or my mind is made up. I don't need to hear more information. I don't need to read more research studies. I'm not open to new perspectives. I have a fixed opinion. That's what it means to be biased in normal usage, right? Now, the kind of bias I'm going to talk about here a little bit is a little bit of a different kind of a bias called a heuristic bias. And heuristic is spelled Heuristic. So it's not a super long word, but it's a word that's not in normal usage really among even well-educated Americans really. So a heuristic is just a shortcut. A heuristic bias is a shortcut way to making decisions that systematically leads to error. So I want to say this again. A heuristic bias is a shortcut to decision making that systematically leads to error. And so most of the kind of what I'm going to say here now for the next few minutes come from the Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but if you're not, I highly recommend it. It's in paperback, came out about 2011. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for maybe well over a year. And yet this book was sort of a summary, a very, a lot of the time, pretty hard to read kind of summary of 30 years of research on cognitive psychology. So, I wondered at the time, how could a book about 30 years of research in cognitive psychology, how could that be a bestseller in the New York Times? How could that even happen? And so the answer to that question is that Kahneman presents that body of research, which is very, very large, in terms of a conflict between two characters, System 1 and System 2. And these are kind of, you might say, mental systems that everyone uses all of the time. And so and Kahneman admits that right off the bat that this is a fiction, right? This is not, our minds really don't have two entities called System 1 and System 2. This is a way of summarizing a whole large body of research in a very compelling way that people will actually read it. And Kahneman was so right about this that he made a fortune on the book. And, and let me just tell you, in this Kahneman book, I probably have read certain sections of the Kahneman book a dozen times or more. I've never read the book wholly, entirely through, because it's practically impossible to do that. Because a lot of the chapters are so involved, and they're you really have to go at it really kind of slowly. And yet he was able to sell a lot of books, right? But because of this, the way he presented the information, System 1 and System 2. So System 1, by far the most interesting of these characters that Kahneman discusses. And so System 1, what is it? It's quick, it's intuitive, it's energetic, it's self-confident, it's decisive, and most importantly, or as important as anything else, it's always on. So what Kahneman says is, from the moment you wake up in the morning till you go to sleep at night, your System 1 is always on. There is no off switch. And what that means concretely is that your mind is always generating a whole series of impressions, intuitions, feelings, desires, thoughts, fragments of thoughts, concerns, fears. And it's always doing that from the time you get up in the morning till you go to sleep at night. Well, why is it doing that? Because it's responsible for your personal safety and the safety of people you love. System 1 is safety oriented. And it is the way our minds operate under time pressures, particularly when we don't have time to think out things or to analyze things. We go back to System 1. System 1 is very, very strongly associated with intuition. It is not into doubt. It is not concerned with ambiguity. It is very, very quick. And it is very self-confident. And why is it self-confident, according to Kahneman? Because most of the time, our System 1 works really, really well. I mean, all of us who are, on this discussion today, in this training, our System 1 works really, really well, or we wouldn't be here. Because our System 1 is responsible for our personal safety, meaning, for the most part, our System 1 works pretty darn well. And because it works well, we tend to have a great confidence in it. So at various times, I've had people say to me just almost naively, that I just totally trust my intuitions. That as I make decisions basically as much on gut, on intuition, as I make on analysis and so forth. Because why? Because I found it works for me. And I have all kind of intuitive insights that I don't know how in the world I ever got them or where they even came from. But they turn out to be a lot of times amazingly accurate about the situation I'm dealing with, about other people, sometimes about myself. Right? So system one is very, very confident. And again, it's energetic. It's always on. Okay, the other quality about it that is very important from the standpoint of decision making is that, according to Kahneman, it is radically indifferent to the quantity and quality of information. So I'm going to say this again. System one is, according to Kahneman, radically indifferent to the quantity and quality of information. So what that means is that system one takes a very small amount of information, whatever is available. And Kahneman has an acronym for this. And the acronym is what you see is all there is. What you see, WYSIATI. What you see is all there is. So it takes a very small amount of information. System one really likes stories. It takes a small amount of information and it connects it in some kind of plausible story. And so, for example, Kahneman uses the example of giving a group a couple of words. And the example he uses is he gives the words banana and vomit. And what he says is within a very few seconds, you don't have to tell a group to make up a story. They just do it. They just do it. They fill in the blanks. They connect those words in some way that makes plausible sense. So this is the way system one operates. It takes information and then it fills in the blanks with some kind of way of connecting the dots that could be totally, completely fictional, but it's plausible in terms of one's own background and experience. So, for example, I ate a rotten banana and it made me feel like I wanted to vomit. I just put the two things together quickly in terms of whatever my history is with these words and with the things that they stand for. Right? Okay, that is system one. Okay, system two, on the other hand, is slow. It's careful, it's analytical, it's deliberate, and according to Kahneman, one of the most important qualities about it is lazy. So why is it lazy? Because it has limited stores of energy. Remember, system one is energetic. System two is lazy because it has very limited sources of energy. So one of the research studies that has been done over and over again that Kahneman refers to is you put people in a room who aren't used to doing a math problem, and you give them some moderately tough math problem, and you tell them to start working on the problem, and then while they're doing that, someone walks in the room with a couple of snacks, and and you tell people you can have one but not both of these snacks, and one of the snacks is freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, and the other one is freshly cut orange slices. And the more people are using their system two, their deliberate analytical system, the more they will pick the sweet, unhealthy snack. Because according to Kahneman, system two literally craves glucose. It's losing energy. Therefore, people tend to only use their system two when they have to. That is, system two, for the most part, system two operates as sort of an agent of system one, according to Kahneman. That is, system one determines preferences, desires, goals, and so forth. System two is more of a strategist. How do I get to that? But system two, in some instances, is also vain. So according to Kahneman, because it has veto power, it can really say no to system one. Doesn't usually do that. That's not its usual function, but it can. It has the ability to check impulses, for example. That's called, of course, executive functioning in psychology. So system two is a form of executive functioning, right? But it also has a cost. So just to explain this idea, which isn't immediately intuitive to people usually, I want to give you a sort of a little puzzle that Kahneman uses. So this is on page 44 of his book. He says, here's a simple puzzle. Do not try to solve it, but listen to your intuition. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And then he says, a number came to your mind. What is the number? Let me say it again. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And then he says, a number came to your mind. What is it?
10 cents.
Yeah. And by the way, groups, when I present this over the years, they always come up with the answer that Kahneman says they're going to come up with, unless they've actually read the book, which sometimes I've run into a few people who have, and who have just stuck it to me right there in the training there. Or if they're sitting there with a paper and pencil, because this isn't that hard of a math problem, right? So what Kahneman says, a number came to your mind. The number, of course, is 10 cents. The distinctive mark of this easy puzzle is that it evokes an answer that is intuitive, appealing, and wrong. Do the math and you will see. If the ball costs 10 cents, the total cost will be $1.20. 10 cents for the ball and 1 cent for the bat, not 1.10. The correct answer is 5 cents. Okay, what Kahneman is doing, it's not a math. He's not testing people's abilities at math. What he's doing is testing the extent to which people are willing to use their system 2, that is their analytical abilities, once their system 1 has given them the answer. Once their intuition has given them the answer, 10 cents, which happens in this case to be wrong, for most people, that's it. Why am I going to use system 2 when I already got the answer? I already know the answer. That is, I'm not. So that is what it means to say that system 2 is lazy. It doesn't exert itself unless it has to from its perspective. Okay, so on the other hand, the vanity thing is, according to Kahneman, completely misplaced most of the time, because for the most part, system 1 is a very headstrong system. And for the most part, it rules the roost. But every once in a while, system 2 can overrule system 1 directives, right? And for that reason, it's vain. But for the most part, according to Kahneman, system 1 determines what our goals are, because it reflects our desires, it reflects our feelings, it reflects our passions, right? And it's associated with intuition. Again, intuition a lot of the time is right. It's very, very powerful. At the same time, it is sometimes wrong. And when it is wrong, then we need the ability to correct it. And that turns out in practice to be difficult, right? On the other hand, system 2 in itself has its own issues. So one of the sort of the main issues with system 2 is that it compartmentalizes things. So Kahneman gives an example of, this is another famous experiment in psychology. You put a couple of teams out on a basketball court, one team dressed in black jerseys, one team dressed in white jerseys. And you give the team a bunch of basketballs. That is, someone who's running the experiment does. And he tells the teams to start passing the basketballs back and forth. And then you put a bunch of student observers on the sideline, and you tell the student observers to count the passes between the teams. How many passes from the black team to the white team and vice versa, right? And then in the middle of this exercise, while this is all going on, someone dressed in a gorilla suit wanders onto the basketball court for 9 seconds. They just don't run across the basketball court, they run onto it, and they sort of run around the basketball court, and then they run off. They're on the basketball court for 9 seconds. So at the end of the experiment, the researcher asked the student observers, how many of you saw the gorilla? And this psychology experiment has been repeated over and over again. The usual answer is around half of the student observers saw the gorilla. The other half didn't. And the half that didn't see the gorilla, they don't believe there was any gorilla until they see the video. They refuse to believe that they did not see a gorilla out on the basketball court for 9 seconds until they're shown the video, right? And so the lesson, so again, why? This isn't a function of intelligence, it's a function of the ability to compartmentalize. Some people can program their minds implicitly in a way that says, I'm looking for basketball passes, I'm not looking for gorillas. And so what Kahneman says is then the lesson of this particular experiment is it's possible to be blind and blind to our blindness. It's possible to be blind and blind to our blindness, right? Okay.
We did that experiment in my graduate program. There was 40 of us, and we had this very complicated like ball thing that we had to do. We were all in circles. One of our instructors showed up in a towel and like was literally walking in between us. And all of us, all 40 of us were like, there is no way that you were there. And then they actually showed the picture of us like playing with all of these balls, trying to keep things going. And the instructor walking around in a bath towel amongst all of us. And even some cases having conversations. It was insane.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the underlying kind of idea here is that, I mean, we look for what we're looking for. And a lot of times if we're not looking for something, we simply don't see it. And that is a lesson, by the way, that comes out in child welfare over and over and over again. I mean, there's a whole bunch of training that I could do on child abuse and neglect that's on that particular theme. That caseworkers simply don't see things if they're not prepared to see them. Okay, so a little bit of an application here to, again, to decision making here. Maybe a little more than 20 years ago, a woman in England named Eileen Monroe, economist, not a folk singer, wrote an article called "Common Errors in Reasoning in Child Protection," and which was a study of 45 child death cases in England that had happened between the mid-1970s and the mid-1990s, and these had been high-profile cases that had been reviewed by multidisciplinary teams in England. And so there were lengthy reports on these cases. And so Monroe went back and looked at those 45 reports, and then she summarized what she found in the reports. And she said that in about a quarter of the report, she didn't see that anyone had done anything wrong at all. I mean, even though there was a child death. I mean, it was very unfortunate, but it wasn't because anyone had made errors, right? But she said in the other 75% of the cases, there were a variety of errors. Some of them were minor, some of them were major, but the most common error by far was the following one. Once people had made up their mind around issues of risk and safety, and they had declared their view on that subject in any kind of a social milieu, in a staffing, in a court hearing, to their supervisor, once they had stated their perspective so that now their reputation was on the line to some extent, then they engaged in what I think Natalie before called confirmation bias. That is, they only looked for information that agreed with their view and they ignored information that disagreed with their view. So this was by far the most common bias in child welfare, and the most common heuristic bias, and the most common heuristic bias in all professions. It's confirmation bias. And this is why I said earlier that there is no way that anyone of any IQ level can overcome confirmation bias on their own. That's why truth-seeking in human services is a social endeavor. Why? Because we cannot control confirmation bias without getting critical input from other people. Why? Because this is the way our minds work. Once we have made up our mind, we are looking for evidence we tend to look for evidence that we're right, and we systematically ignore evidence that we're wrong. So the way that confirmation bias works a lot of the time is that people don't even really feel that they're biased at all. Why? Because they have all kind of evidence that their views are right. And they've gone looking for that evidence and they found it. At the same time, they're not really aware of evidence that conflicts with their views because they have systematically ignored that evidence. They have refused to consider it. That's why confirmation bias is incredibly powerful in child welfare and in every other profession, because this is the way, and by the way, this isn't just in, of course, this is not just in child welfare, this is in everywhere. This is, political discussions, religious discussions, all discussions of social values. I found in child welfare when I was a manager, when I would be asked to review cases, when the decision I was being asked to make or to reflect on, when there was a complete lack of research that would help me or anybody else to make that decision, the people who came to me were incredibly powerfully convinced that they were right. The less information they had to support, the less research they had to support their view, the more convinced they were that they were right. The more information that there was, the less convinced that they were right, right? So it's just almost the opposite of what you would expect, right? So lack of information leads to conviction. And this is partly a result of the confirmation bias kind of thing. So to be a better decision maker, the first thing and the most important thing, if you take anything away from this training this morning at all, I hope you'll take this. You have to figure out how to deal with confirmation bias in your own case and the case of everyone that you work with. So I want you to think for a second about, well, what would be some of those ways? I'm going to talk about another bias here in a minute, but now I just want to, because we're going to run out of time here. So I want to, since this is the most important message I got in this training, I want to focus on this for just a second. What would be some strategies, do you think, at a personal level or at a group level for controlling the power of confirmation bias?
Well, I'm thinking as you're talking that the one sort of weakness in our system is that people tend to make decisions on their own, and process the information, everything, and come up with a decision, and then they're asked to repeatedly weigh in as the case goes on. And so that reinforces their perspective. And I think one way we could address that is to more routinely have group discussion regarding situations, and not in the group discussion to specifically try not to engage in groupthink.
Yeah, those are very, very thoughtful comments, and those are kind of some of the conclusions that we came to in child welfare when I was there. I worked for the system, as you may remember, for 26 years in this state, and we were constantly thinking about how to improve decision making. And this was one of the things that we came to over a period of time, that we wanted, whenever possible, when we were making major league decisions, to do it in a shared kind of fashion through staffing approaches if possible, right? And we wanted there to be a part of the staffing where people really had to listen to other people without weighing in on their views and so forth, right? And so, and we kind of ultimately took it to extremes, so that, we just created one staffing on top of another one on top of another one, to the point where it became kind of an impossible thing to actually do. But the underlying instinct was right there, right? We want to make decisions in a way where we have to have an interchange with other people before we have reached a conclusion. Once we have reached a conclusion, you can have all the interchanges you want with anybody, and the more they argue with you, the stronger your opinion is. Not the weaker your opinion is, the stronger it is, right? So this suggests another kind of way of becoming a better decision maker. You want to be able to stand the tension, the ambiguity of just withholding judgment for as long as possible. And when I was a caseworker, and before I ever read any books on cognitive psychology or anything on critical thinking, I could always tell that in my own, the way I did things, that there was a tension about withholding judgment. That I could sense in myself, a desire to rush to judgment very, very quickly based on whatever information that I had initially. And I understood instinctively kind of that I needed to restrain that, but I could never understand why there was a tension about that. Why was that kind of an aversive experience? Why was that difficult to do? And of course, it wasn't until I read Kahneman that I understood why it was difficult to do, right? Because that's our system one operating, right? It is a mechanism for jumping to conclusions very, very quickly. So when you try to that takes energy to restrain that tendency. But to become a better decision maker, that's exactly what you need to be able to do. You need to withhold judgment until you've heard other perspectives, until and a lot of times until you have enough information. Remember, the tendency of system one is to, what you see is all there is. Very small amounts of information, and then you jump to a conclusion. And so a lot of times you want to withhold judgment till you have more information. You have more of a basis for making a sound kind of decision, kind of thing, right? What else can we do with confirmation bias? You got to be able to listen to other people who don't agree with you. You got to be able to hear them out without interrupting them, without being sarcastic about what they're saying. That just takes training. It just takes training to do that. And particularly if people who are talking really have values that are very different from our own, it's very difficult to bite one's tongue. But that's the way you become a better decision maker. You know, that is, you withhold judgment to the extent you hear people out. That doesn't mean you have to capitulate to their perspective or their point of view. You don't have to be indifferent to their obnoxious social value that you sense in the way they're presenting something, but you still have to listen to what they have to say and ask yourself the question, is there any basis for this? Is there any basis for this? I mean, given that I don't agree with the conclusion, is there any basis for it? It very much helps to, something as simple as just slow down. Don't make decisions quickly if you don't have to. Remember, system one is a way of making decisions very, very quickly under time pressures. But when you don't have those kind of time pressures there's no basis for using system one kind of habits, right? We can just take our time. You know, one of the first things I learned when I became a manager in the child welfare agency was when people ask me, you know, maybe even passing in a hall or in a break room or something like that, if they ask me for something or they ask me for a decision, I learned very quickly to say, I'll think it over. You know, how about that one? I'll think it over rather than I'm just going to say yes or no right on the spot here, right? So just don't make decisions in hurried ways if you don't have to. Now, that doesn't probably apply to, you know, CASAs as much as it applies to caseworkers, but it is really a factor in casework because the way you operate in child welfare a lot of times is on adrenaline. And so you get used to making lots of decisions every day very, very quickly. And there's kind of an adrenaline rush that's associated with that, right? And it ends up, it's really a bad habit. It has a bad effect on your health and on your mental health ultimately. But a lot of times it gets caseworkers through the day. It's how they kind of function. But you also develop some very bad habits by doing it. It is very helpful to be able to paraphrase the argument of someone with whom you disagree in a completely objective way. And this is something that when I worked for the agency, I was very impressed with the attorneys, with their ability to do this. They did it so much better than the caseworkers. Why? Because they had been to law school where they really had to do that. In order to be an effective debater, you have to be able to summarize the best argument of your opponent. And then you have to have an argument that conflicts with and overwhelms the best argument of your opponent. To do that, you have to be able to summarize the best argument of your opponent. Again, without any sarcasm whatsoever, without any kind of a put down, to be able to summarize the argument of people with whom you disagree. A lot of times, if you disagree with someone about a matter of real importance, you know, you might sit there and have a conversation about, well, what would be a way of resolving our difference here? Is there some test or some kind of information that would help to resolve this difference that, you know, that we could actually apply here, rather than just going back and forth with an increasingly antagonistic argument? Is there some other kind of research? Is there some, you know, perspective? Is there a psychological evaluation? Is there a screening tool? Is there something we could use that would contribute and be helpful to both of us in coming to a decision? So some of the common kind of ways here. And then, of course, ultimately, I think there has to be a recognition that to have intellectual integrity means to be able to say you're wrong. You know, and there's a funny idea, and maybe this is true in all countries, it's definitely true in the US, however, that the incredible focus on being right all the time. You know, who is right all the time? You know, most of us are wrong a lot of the time. And so having intellectual strength, having intellectual confidence, part of that is the willingness to admit you're wrong when you are wrong. And this is how you know whether someone is biased or not biased. It's not how strongly they hold an opinion. It's whether they can change that opinion in response to new evidence. So when I was a supervisor in child welfare, for example, the only time that I ever reassigned a case, a family from one caseworker to another, and I got asked to do that daily. But I would never do that unless I found out that the caseworker simply couldn't process new information about the person, either of a positive or negative nature. If the caseworker had such strong feelings about someone, if they were, so to speak, so biased, their mind was made up about the person, that they couldn't process new information, I would reassign the case. Otherwise, the answer was no. You're just going to have to work out your differences there. But if someone can't process new information, they cannot be an adequate decision maker. It just cannot be so. So sometimes, when you have time, you might think about, the question, in the last couple of years or 2 or 3 years, or, you even use a longer time period. In the last few years, have I changed my mind about anything important to me based on new evidence or information? Anything at all? Any social value, any belief about anything in the world, any opinion of any type? Have I changed my mind ever in recent memory in response to new information? And if the answer to that question is, maybe not, or I can't remember doing that, then you should go back and reflect on the way you're processing information there, right? Because again, the tendency of our experience is to engage in confirmation bias over and over and over again. So that's our opinions just get strengthened, right? Because that's the way we're operating. Right? Now, just in one more bias that I want to talk about here in the few minutes we have left here is what Kahneman calls the halo effect. And the halo effect is what he calls the power of first impressions, but it goes something like this. If I like someone, I like everything about them. If I meet someone for the first time and I kind of view them as friendly, convivial, funny, humorous, enjoyable to be with, I tend to think very positive things about them. If I don't like someone, I have trouble admitting that they have any virtues. If they just seem like a complete jerk the first time I meet them, then I have trouble admitting that they might be actually intelligent, thoughtful, deliberate, ethical. Hard for me really to believe that, right? So it just turns out that in child welfare, as in every other area of life, our personal feelings about people really, really get involved in the decisions that we make about them. And it's really hard to believe that that's true with adults, but it definitely is true in child welfare. So lots of times caseworkers can get very enmeshed with parents in a way that they have trouble acknowledging that their positive view of that parent just wasn't valid. Or it can be the other way around. You can have such a view of a person as just view a person as a villain, a scumbag, a jerk, someone who's just mistreated their kid in the most, vile way. And then hard to recognize that that person might have some redeeming virtue there. So again, that's something that all of us can really practice. We can really practice that, separating out our personal feelings from our views about what actually happened in a particular event or incident. People that we like can do very bad things. People that we love can do very bad things. All of us know that. People that we don't like can do very good things. And most of us would even be able to think of a few examples of that, right? So that just turns out to be a principle in child welfare that we can apply over and over. We can ask ourselves the question, are my personal feelings about this person affecting my decisions in this case? And so that is where it's very helpful in child welfare as in other areas to have a kind of a self-reflective, not self-reflective, but kind of someone who helps you, kind of a self-reflection partner. Someone who you can talk about with things and they can give you that kind of feedback. They can tell you the truth without hurting your feelings, right? About the way you're processing information, about the way that you're thinking through a particular case. So last one I want to do is I want to recommend a book that uses a lot of the Kahneman material, but does it in a way that's a lot easier to read, a lot easier to understand. The Kahneman book is great, but you have to really, to benefit from it, you really have to study particular sections of it. With this book called Decisive, this book right here by Chip and Dan Heath, called How to Make Better Choices in Life and Work, the Heath brothers really use a lot of the information from Kahneman's book in a way that's a lot easier to assimilate, a lot easier to understand. And so you can read that book in 2 hours, something like that. Anyway, I recommend it. And then what I'm going to do is in the next, probably this afternoon or tomorrow, I will send Ryan a summary, a sounding board on the kind of critical thinking issues that I've talked about for the last hour, and sort of summaries of the Kahneman book. I'll send you something you can use, and then if you're interested in other kind of materials, you can always get in touch or ask Ryan to get in touch with me, and I would be glad to provide. So I think with that, I'm going to stop, and it's 12:12. So let's just take a minute or two here to see if anyone has comments or questions here.
But one dynamic I observe a lot is that once if a CASA or other party starts to really disagree with another party, communication breaks down.
Mhm.
And then as time develops, both parties are relying on different information because they're not communicating. And the gap in the knowledge just gets bigger and bigger. And it becomes very difficult to even have a conversation. It's almost like you're talking about two different cases.
Yeah, well, that's sort of a description of what's happened with the partisan divide in this country, just what you just said there. But right, but it happens in child welfare as well. So this is, again, something that is kind of a matter of personal habits that all of us can work on. Right, the ability to have civil discussions with people with whom we disagree, and to maintain the communication with that person, even though we don't agree with them. Right, and so the tendency a lot of times to cut off communication, as you've just said, cut off communication with that person, in which case, you're dealing with a different set of, so to speak, facts than the other person is dealing with. And sometimes, and particularly when you're talking about children's lives here, we're just not talking about, how I'm going to vote in November or something like that. We're talking about children's lives. That is a very, very injurious way of making decisions. So sometimes, really, there needs to be an intermediary. Sometimes there needs to be, and that's why, courts use mediators, people who can sort of go back and forth with people who have very emotional reactions to cases. And sometimes in child welfare, we need people running meetings who are really able to do that. We're able to get people to maintain enough calm that they can at least hear the other side out. And so that we have, insofar as possible, a common set of, so to speak, facts or information that we're dealing with here. And when you don't have that, I don't know how you make decisions at all, really, in any kind of a reasonable way there. So, but again, this is something where all of us can work at this. I guess this is the other kind of message that I want to leave you with here, is that we can all do better at listening to other people, at allowing other people to disagree with us, that thinking rationally about the basis for our own decisions, that asking myself the question, is there something I've overlooked? Being willing to admit that we're wrong. We can, and sometimes we actually need to enlist the help of other people. So, just to say this one more time, people on their own can never overcome confirmation bias on their own. That is a social endeavor. Okay, so I think with that, I'm going to stop. It's 12:16. I've used my time here, so I'll send Ryan something in the next day. There. Thanks.